So I'm going to explore, firstly, through a little-known paper written by Jung in 1921, how his far-sighted ideas concerning the core self that emerges often explosively in psychic disturbance turns out to be at the cutting edge of recent studies in neuroscience. In the past, Jung's contribution has often been devalued, misunderstood, and misused, which is something he feared at the end of his life. But from what I can tell these days, his impact is just beginning to come into his own. I've always thought he was ahead of his time. New developments have come in on the heels of the dominance of cognitive neuroscience and viewpoints based primarily on the attributes of left brain functions, which have a debilitating impact on the individual and on society, and that Jung had to face in his own confrontation with the unconscious. Exciting variations of analytic-based theory and clinical practice have emerged in recent years and have impacted my patient and supervisory work. I hope they will offer ways of working that you might find helpful too. My talk is going to be accompanied by 2 case vignettes, and I will conclude with an illustration from the visual arts. So, a fundamental change in vision, activating the transformational energies of the mind. And I'd like to begin by dedicating this talk to my former supervisor of many years, the Jungian analyst Colleen Covington, who died unexpectedly last year. Colleen played a vital role in my development as an analyst and as a supervisor, and her last book, Who's to Blame? Collective Guilt on Trial, published soon after her death, contains an important viewpoint that resonates with my talk today. So, here's Colleen. I do not subscribe to the particular psychoanalytic view that there should be no goal to psychoanalytic treatment. Failure to acknowledge that there is a goal to this process is equivalent to denying our psychic need to develop and understand ourselves, our inner and external realities, and through this understanding, not to be led blindly by the complexes of the past. Psychoanalysis is necessarily a teleological endeavor, i.e. an endeavor that has a goal. Now, when I start working with a new patient, I'm often struck by how powerfully they are being led blindly by the emotion-driven complexes of the past, and how this limits the possibilities of them having a mindful and creative partnership with themselves and with others. How the treatment needs to address both the morbidity, the unhealthy current situation, as Jung suggests, but also requires the building up of a new attitude that is sound and healthy, that might on occasions lead to a fundamental change in vision, which can often be brief, but powerful enough not to be forgotten. An experience that for me resonates with the 19th century alchemical woodcut that I began this talk with. Now, all these issues that Jung addresses in The Therapeutic Value of Abreaction. And contrary to the apparent drift of the title, Jung is questioning the value of continued explosively letting off steam as part of a treatment. While this may provide a sense of temporary relief, he asserts that it does not lead to fundamental change. He writes, "Therefore, the work of the doctor is to offer the patient, quote, a real psychological relationship that engages directly and primarily with emotional moods and outbursts. Otherwise, for the patient, there is the danger of perpetually brooding on the past, of looking back wistfully to things that cannot be remedied now. The morbid tendency, very common among neurotics, always to seek the cause of their inferiority in the dim bygone, in their upbringing, the character of their parents, and so on. And this means that in time, treatment has to address the intensified tie to the doctor through the transference relationship that merely represents projections from the past and therefore acts as a substitute relationship rather than a real one. Jung considers that it is the continuing impact of early dissociations and complexes that is holding back the development of the personality of the patient. And he is suggesting a more relational approach that works outside and alongside the patient, as well as working with the transference, an approach that has been coming into view in contemporary analytic practice for some time now. And having had access to Jung's Red Book, published in 2009, and the Black Books, published in 2020, it becomes clear that Jung is drawing powerfully on his own overwhelming and shattering emotional experience as he writes this paper. Jung at midlife succumbed to a defeat of his ego, with a tremendous inner pull away from his busy, ambitiously successful life. He went through 3 years, at least 3 years, of emotional chaos, but came out of it with the understanding that here was an urgent communication from what he called the spirit of the depths, to re-find his lost soul. To do this, he had to mentally work hard to find the images and words that were held as potential in these outbursts. Jung's psyche soma was letting him know how dangerously out of psychological balance he had become. And this lack of balance was signaling the need for a deep change. He must have been very difficult to live with during these years. He slept with a gun under his pillow during the worst times, in case things got so bad that he had to kill himself, something that his children later spoke of being aware of. And he had a terrible irascible temper, which he continued to struggle with in his old age. The Red Book introduces the reader to the inner cast of characters that Jung felt compelled to recognize and record, and that manifested from his overcharged states during this time. Each character had a different inner experience to offer him, and he painted these pictures and recorded their words carefully, recognizing in them living symbols that were coming into shape from powerful feeling states emerging into consciousness. I had the really good fortune to visit Jung's private retreat, Bollingen, on Lake Zurich earlier this year. It was a memorable trip, something I've wanted to do for years. A small group of us were shown around by one of Jung's grandchildren, who was 13 when Jung died, so he knew him well. And he clearly recognized Jung as a brilliant and extraordinary personality, and proudly showed us Jung's stone carvings, and you can see some of them here, and how the retreat structure had been expanded by Jung over the years. Although he had only known his grandfather as a much older man, he had clearly found him both distant and bad-tempered at times, and difficult to get along with. Jung's near breakdown in mid-age occurred partially as a result of the split with Freud, but I think more primarily out of the impact of the terrible destructiveness of the 1914-18 war, which Jung had previously envisaged on a train journey in a terrifying waking experience of rivers flowing with blood. Jung believed that the devastation of war in Europe had its roots in powerful, unstoppable energies emerging from the depths of the archetypal collective unconscious, and that mostly have a biological location in the brain. Towards the end of his life, he wrote, "I have long thought that if there is any analogy between psychic and physiological processes, the organizing system of the brain must lie subcortically on the brain stem, and might somehow reflect characteristic of the archetypal form of consciousness." At this time, Jung could only intuit what future research into the brain and its connection with mind would reveal. But today, his explorations into the archetypal nature of the human psyche predate aspects of the contemporary contributions from the people that I want to introduce today. Psychiatrist, neuroscience researcher and philosopher Ian McGilchrist, the psychoanalyst and neuropsychologist, the affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, the psychoanalyst and neuropsychologist Mark Soames, who has extended Panksepp's work in the discipline of neuropsychoanalysis. And finally, the trauma specialist Janina Fisher. Now, I imagine that many of you are familiar with the impact Ian McGilchrist has made with these two major works, in which he cites an almost overwhelming body of research, laying out how the Western world has disastrously overvalued the abilities of the left hemisphere, to the detriment of those of the right hemisphere of the brain. But most importantly, he's clarified that the fundamental difference between the two is not primarily about what each of them do. It's the vital different modes of attention that they afford. The left provides a focused, scientific view of minutely dissected bits, while offering aspects of reality. When out of balance with the right brain's broader holistic attention, the left brain leaves us a sadly limited version of who we are as human beings and how we relate to the world. The right hemisphere comes online first and is dominant for at least the first 2 years of life. It picks up similar patterns in things and is remarkably awake and alert to imagery, non-verbal communication, and the emotional life. It's capable of living with uncertainty, providing the ground from which the left brain's focusing and dissecting attributes can then start to function. But it's the integration of the left brain's activity through right brain activity that is mandatory for integration, growth, and change. And here's McGilchrist again. The right hemisphere both grounds our experience of the world at the bottom end, so to speak, and makes sense of it at the top end. This hemisphere is more in touch with both affect and the body. Neurological evidence supports what is called the primacy of affect and the primacy of unconscious over conscious will. Now, this knowledge would have benefited Charles Darwin, I think. In a letter to his children towards the end of his life, he wrote, "My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. But why this should have caused the atrophy of that part of the brain alone on which the higher tastes depend, I cannot conceive. And if I had my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once a week. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may probably be injurious to the intellect and more probably to the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." The work of the late affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp has highlighted that the emotional part of our nature emerges from a range of mammalian survival systems, hardwired into separate pathways in the brainstem. He discovered 7 unique circuits, some representing painful feeling states, others pleasurable ones. Each circuit represents an essential human need whose good enough satisfaction facilitates the healthy secondary growth of the mind. But if these needs are not sufficiently met, this falling out of balance will trigger eventually intense and overwhelming feelings. Panksepp's work is trailblazing, in that it moves some of the intensity of scientific interest away from traditional neocortical frontal brain research into the affective circuits of the brainstem. And with a later collaborator, Mark Soames, Panksepp demonstrated that these emotional circuits are essential communicators with the outside world. But they do require the psychologically real relationship to activate them in the mindful, psychologically real way that Jung noted. Although appearing to be unconscious, these emotional circuits, akin to Jung's deep archetypal potentials, are triggered into violent feeling activity if there's a loss of internal equilibrium, and they thus present an id that is conscious and far from being made up of mere reflexes as historically believed. The emotional circuits of the lower brain activate and put a demand on the mind to work and develop from experience, from emotional experience. They are, according to Soames, the hidden spring, the hidden source of our more evolved mid and upper brain consciousness. And this is Mark Soames' sort of public book. It's written for clinicians, and it's also written for the general public. It's a great read. I'd really recommend it. And I've been enrolled in Mark Soames' online clinical sessions for a couple of years and have found his take on Panksepp's work invaluable and highly amenable for opening up Jungian theory in a contemporary way. And here's a summary of my understanding of some of the key points in Soames's clinical approach. He suggests in clinical work, we need to question why we limit ourselves to psychoanalytic approaches and theory. We also need to look for enactments, revealing autonomized ways of dealing with relational difficulties, and draw attention to the patient seeming to live in the present while emotionally living in the transference, and therefore in the past. Recognize that the transference creates a distortion, an illusory relationship that needs the analytic pair to problematize, to see how it's restricting the patient in all sorts of ways. Create options in the present through the relationship of the analytic pair. And finally, to start simple. What is the main system of feeling that has been deprived of in the patient and the patient is bringing for treatment? So let's just look at these 7 circuits in a bit more detail. First of all, there is the seeking drive. Now for Panksepp, this is the default drive. And it's the really important drive in which we explore and seek out new experiences and rewards. And this, according to Panksepp, is needed to be there before anything else, and was powerfully envisaged by Jung in his forward-striving function, a term he first introduced in 1912, but that underlays all of his subsequent theory, maturing after he discovered alchemy into his central concept of individuation. Then there's rage, the experience of anger, indignation, and aggression. Fear, responses to threats and danger. Care, the experience of nurturing, attachment, and affection. Lust, the drive for sexual pleasure and reproduction. And here Soames points out, interestingly, he is the editor of the new collected works of Freud that's coming out shortly. So he knows a lot about Freud. And he points out that this is one of the areas where Freud got it wrong. There's a lot more to our fundamental needs, he says, as Jung realized, than the sex drive. Panic grief, the response to separation, loss, and distress. This comes from really early damage. Play and joy, the experience of pleasure, joy, playfulness, creativity. So, with this work in mind, I'd like to introduce my first piece of case material, which is a composite case to protect confidentiality. Peter is a financial advisor in his 50s who has been in twice-weekly therapy with me for about 3 years. Initially, nothing was ever right. His natural means of communication was through despairing and attacking complaints about himself, his parents long dead, his grown-up daughter, his wife from whom he is divorced, difficult colleagues at work, and the time and money he is spending on therapy. When I suggested that there might be other perspectives to think about, that the difficult people and situations he talks about will have their own separate experience of the events, there was a whiff of superiority in his response. Oh, come on then, you're the expert. I'm waiting for you to give me the answer. What's the trick? There is no sense of a creative or curious collaboration. And for a long time, he had repeated crises about his health. When sheer panic overtook the therapy time, he'd arrive in dreadful panics that completely overwhelmed his ego, but that were not entirely convincing because he was in an illusory state of mind. He was in a complex. Throughout my countertransference, I got the message that at some level, he is in a terror that his life is about to end right now, and that his psyche is shoved up right against time. There is no time. He's running out of time. Everything is being lost. Help, help, help. His talking fills the space. He is in what Panksepp calls panic grief, a response to separation and loss. But we are by now at least building up some sort of narrative together, some sort of way of talking about this overwhelming feeling state. A powerful and recognizable morbid transference has been building up, and I'm starting to see that even if we get a flutter of deeper safety and intimacy, this resulting in a more peaceful atmosphere, then there will soon be a backlash about his health. This seems to be an ingrained way of keeping control in an old and very painful manner. And at these times he talks and talks in an anguished but addictive way, so that it's impossible to get through to him. He is dissociating. Sometimes, keeping my words directly in the present, I say a version of, hold on, with all this talking, I'm losing you. Come back into the room. Let's talk together. And then sometimes he can relax. More recently, he's told me, I get into talking more and more because in my mind, you are getting further and further away. And the more I talk, the further away you are, until you are very small and distant, and I can't reach you and I can't stop myself from talking. He goes on, and then I want to kick you, to smash your face in. I can't stop myself. You have to stop me. I try to be a mirror reflecting back to him the sheer power of his fantasies that I believe are stemming from a vulnerable need to connect to somebody who is going to stay with him and his problems. I tell him I get the sense from his panics that he's letting me know about the presence of an inner, screaming, desperate child with no one to console him. With help disappearing into the distance, the louder he screams. Even the aggression, I suggest, is a way of trying to get connected. But that works against him, as he can see, for I seem in his mind, in the transference, to get further away. So we need some new options. But right now, he just can't stop himself. I can see that. I tell him, I get the sense you are inside an old memory of feelings that are like, well, being in hell. He says, yes, that's it. That's just where I am. And then he tells me that knowing about this hell and me knowing about this hell gives him some relief. Just us talking together about this terrifying place where he's drowning, not through jumping into water suicidally, but through something dark and terrifying, slowly and inevitably rising up from below and smothering him. I say, I think he's talking to me about feelings, the feeling of terribly frightening feelings overwhelming him. And slowly, things settle down. He tells me what is coming to mind is asking his maths teacher at boarding school what the answer is to a sum he's struggling with. He tells me he liked the math teacher and made this request many times, but the teacher always said, oh, I don't know the answer. You have to work that out on your own. He was left with the conviction that even though he doesn't understand how to do something, he has to struggle in silence and rage by himself. That can be the problem, I think, with long silences in analytic work. I mean, particularly when a patient isn't ready for silence. So he has only himself to rely upon. And for him, this is emotionally true. When his parents divorced, his aggressive reaction to their divorce led to him being sent to a boarding school. His mother felt she couldn't cope. And then he had long journeys to get back home at the end of term. He doesn't relate to anyone very well at school, posing as a bully to try and fend off his fears, which is what I believe he's doing when he threatens to beat me up. I tell him, you know, I think you're still there at school, trying to manage on your own. You're not really in the present in this room with me. You're in the past. This is the transference. And as I say this, I realise I've never been able to talk to him directly about transference before. It's never made this sort of sense in the consulting room. There is a long silence until he says, well, what am I going to do now? I thought I was coming to the end of therapy, and now a whole new world has just opened up that feels real, is giving me more space. What's happening? I say, I think you've just let me in. And this feels quite momentous. As time goes by, we both begin to notice that the panics are lessening in intensity and frequency. People are relating better in dreams. He tells me, I feel like I'm coming out of some sort of prison, but I can't tell you how frightening this is. I recognize how my complaining self keeps me safe from others, even though he keeps me unhappy and alone. In fact, I now see him as trying to help me in a muddled sort of way, because neither me nor him has any sort of structure about how to be well. So I keep falling back into the old places. I tell him that even as he speaks, I believe that we are building that structure together right now, but it isn't a quick fix or a trick. It takes time. He then admits that for some time he has been feeling a bit different, more hopeful, but very worried to admit it, in case the good feelings just disappear because he has claimed them. I say that I think the new can be frightening because it is unknown and out of his control. But it does sound as though he's just daring to imagine a more hopeful future in which he can be with other people in a different way. He says, actually, I've noticed that I'm thinking a bit more about my parents these days, and in a subtly different way. Like they're not all that bad. I don't think they understood me or what I needed as a rather lonely, difficult child. They were too involved in their own world and their own problems. His voice has a different, more grown-up tone as he says this. No longer the abandoned, frightened child, but a potentially helpful and thoughtful self. The work continues. My second clinical vignette is centred on patient dreams, but will also introduce the work of Janina Fisher. Dreams can be so helpful in analytic work as they allow therapist and patient to enter a world that is not dominated by left brain or ego consciousness. It's the right hemisphere that is dominant in the process of dreaming. The left hemisphere, being at a lower level of arousal during sleep or daydreams, can then provide an inner observer of the psychic process, and afterwards can sometimes hold the dream in memory on waking. Working with dreams can activate one of Panksepp's most essential emotional hubs, play. I will call this patient Helen, whom I saw for 3 times and then 2 times weekly analysis for about 10 years. She kindly permitted me to talk about our work. Helen had been sent for adoption immediately following her birth, and she spent her first 6 highly formative weeks in a children's home until she was chosen for adoption. My first impressions of Helen were of a friendly and easygoing professional single mother in her early 40s with an imposing frame and presence. I was struck immediately that you wouldn't want to mess with Helen, although I perceived a personality that had not yet come to ground and dabbled in a variety of semi-spiritual practices that somehow were not satisfying her. She presented with anxieties about eating and her increasing weight gain. This had led to the fear of sudden death through a stroke, particularly worrying for a single mother with a young child. I soon began to suspect that this fear of suddenly dying was rooted in her earliest dissociative experiences. Helen's first dream, often called the herald dream because it can reveal the major issues that will arise in treatment, featured several babies trapped in a deep well, with Helen, the egoic dreamer, dominating the scene but being impotent. There was no ladder or any means of reaching these babies. And nearby, a man was tied to a wheel that Helen linked with Leonardo da Vinci's scientific drawing. But the wheel was in constant motion, making him unavailable to help with any rescue. And he was tied fast to the wheel. Helen's dream images suggest dissociated, imprisoned, tied-up aspects of the self that Helen would soon experience profoundly as the therapy progressed. She began to feel herself drop into extreme feelings of terror and abandonment when alone at night, that would lead to fits of wailing, where she felt forced to get up and stare at herself in the mirror to get some sort of human connection, yet felt paralyzed in seeing herself as an empty, screaming mouth. Action alone was ineffective, but I believe it was occurring out of the need to use our relationship for psychological adaptation, to give her some sort of cognitive structure to hold these nighttime terrors. Through my own experience of long-term analysis and many frightening dreams, and some very good supervision, I was able to hold in my mind the probability that Helen was re-experiencing, remembering in the present, terrifying and unprocessed feelings of abandonment from her babyhood. The absence of a psychological mother in her early weeks had most likely meant that she had no one to relate to her most primal feeling states and so find soothing from another. Although she would have been physically well cared for in the nursing home, she had probably never, well, she certainly never had connections with the mother who had birthed her and whose voice and smell she was primed for. And if she had managed to adapt to a particular nurse, as a neonate, and she wasn't sure about this, this attachment would have ended without warning when she was 6 weeks old. She would have been taken away from everything she was accustomed to. Eventually, she was able to talk to me about how, alongside her regular devouring of a packet of biscuits or a complete chocolate cake, she had for years regularly and impotently observed herself buying a box of cake mix after work, mixing it with milk at home, and secretly gobbling the sweet, gloopy mess down while her young child was watching TV. She was left with dreadful feelings of shame and guilt, and the commitment never to do this again. Yet she would find herself compelled to repeat this activity as though from some hidden force, week after week. This, of course, is the unconscious will. Together we came to understand that this regular and addictive stuffing herself with a milky substance was an enactment that was communicating an early lack of psychological feeding from dependable and nuanced mothering, needed to help integrate her most primal feeling states. And over the years, I've come to believe that this lack of psychological feeding applies to a good proportion of anorexic and bulimic patients. And it's work that is so primary, it is virtually impossible to do on your own. In fact, I'm not sure you can do it on your own, because it relates to such early states that require a twosome, that require attachment and an outside, tender and thinking mind as part of the growth process. As the years passed, Helen's observing ego entered into uncanny dreams of primary process, imaged as desert landscapes with nothing but strange insects to accompany her. Sometimes she was underwater with sea slugs and snails, lonely, immersive places, but not dead environments. They contained simple life forms, not yet mammalian, with which the dreaming ego appeared to be connecting. And I began to suggest that it might be helpful if Helen could go back inside some of her dreams while in my presence to get to know and report back about this strange, almost disconnected inner world. I became aware I was using elements of Jung's active imagination in this sort of work, something that I don't usually do. Occasionally, working with a less interpretive stance, I would even speak to these dream parts myself. In this respect, I found the work of Janina Fisher, the American trauma specialist, helpful in further thinking about and developing a more right brain view that feels appropriate to analytic practice. Fisher sees her concepts and way of working as complementary to most psychodynamic therapies, and I find it particularly sympathetic to a Jungian model, with Jung's concept of a naturally dissociated psyche with its multiple complexes. These complexes can then come into a more conscious togetherness as a result of the lifelong process of individuation. So let me pause Helen's story to give a summary of this approach. Fisher writes, though children are born with both hemispheres, they are right brain dominant for most of childhood. The slower developing left brain has spurts of growth around age 2 and again at adolescence. But the development of top-down or left brain dominance is only achieved very gradually. Thus, in the early years of childhood, right brain experience is relatively independent of left brain experience, lending itself to splitting should the need arise. There's those complexes, of course. Fisher advises that severely traumatized clients often cannot work without some sort of psychoeducation to help provide them with an egoic structure to think about their dissociated parts that are driven by and manifest some combination of the classic animal survival responses of fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach. And here's her map that she sometimes uses directly with her clients, but that personally I've used for my own edification. Let me give you just a few moments to take that in. And you can see at the bottom the different characters that might emerge out of these different survival responses. Fisher refers to the going on with normal life self, which has been able to bring the adult client into therapy. The going on with normal life self is the only aspect of the client that Fisher refers to as you. All the other aspects she addresses as parts. These emotion-driven parts of the client tend to take over and blend with the you, leading the you to over-identify with highly disturbed aspects of themselves. And sadly, this then tends to pathologize the you that has in fact been coping with life and needs support to manage the dissociated parts. And this is why I have a concern with too easily thinking about this you as a false self, to use Winnicottian language, because actually it's using it's playing a very important role, and a positive role, really. Fisher relates primarily to the going on with normal life self throughout each session, while simultaneously holding on to the fact that the you is being powerfully influenced all the time by the split-off, traumatized parts that form separate personified characters, each with their distinctive instinctual responses. And I've been struck by how closely the parts relate to Jung's interactions with his non-egoic internal characters in the Red Book, all with separate personalities and representing dissociated complexes of the psyche. Fisher facilitates her clients to go inside themselves during a session to connect with enactments by the parts. She helps her clients to begin to dialogue with these parts in order to unblend from them and get to understand them from a separated perspective that can differentiate from the different survival strategies that the parts have adopted in order to try and keep the you safe in terrifying moments of trauma. And there's something of this you may remember in the clinical work with Peter. He actually came to believe that his moods were actually trying to help him in a way, but they just weren't being very helpful. And the result of this gradual unblending, of the you being able to sort of step back a bit from this blending, is often a new compassionate response from the you towards the dissociated parts, rather than hating and punishing them. What is important is the therapist picking up of non-verbal enactments during the session, so that the activity of the parts can be brought into conscious interaction and valued as communication. Fisher confirms that rather than increasing the chances of splitting, which has been a fear expressed by other professionals, that this relational method of engagement between the you and the parts helps to draw the psyche together over time into a more conscious unity. And isn't this exactly what Jung was doing with his work in his confrontation with the unconscious, and all the drawing and the writing down of what was going on? Of course, each therapeutic couple need to find their own approach to Fisher's contribution, which can then become a vital exploratory aspect of the treatment. Unless that is, the client becomes immersed or blended too much into a nightmare or hallucinatory state, when in my experience, it's essential to pull them out of a re-traumatization and establish a safe base as soon as possible. We could talk a bit more about that if you want to. Back to Helen. And to a series of repetitive dreams in the later years of our work that image the development of the link between higher and lower levels of the mind and the coming together of different parts. The dream centered around a room at the top of a tall building that contained an open window on the far side and a large oval table in the middle, around which a few men were immersed in their discussions and were unaware that now and then someone entered the room and jumped out of the window, falling to the depths below. The dream made us wonder if parts of Helen were feeling unnoticed, disconnected, even suicidal. And we began to leave more extended silences then to enable Helen to re-enter her dreams and talk about what was going on in her inner world through feeling her way consciously and slowly down into it in my presence. So this is the use of the ego now. This is the use of consciousness going in to these deeper, more brainstem connected parts. As a result, a different, more tender, concerned atmosphere emerged, rather than the slightly detached left brain one we had been leaning towards at times. And over the following weeks, there were repeated dream versions of people sitting around a table. And Helen was picking up small changes that confirmed that she was not just seeing a repetitive scene. Now more people were talking and fewer people were jumping out of the window. Not only were we attending to the unconscious through the dream and our explorations of the dream, but the unconscious process appeared to be talking back to us, contributing to the ongoing work. By the end of this series of dreams, equal numbers of men and women were talking at the table, and no one was jumping out of the window. It would also seem that something feminine had joined with the men at the table to create a complementary, more balanced and diverse atmosphere. The unconscious appeared to be going through a process of expansion and reconstruction. Helen began to talk about her growing sense that her work with me might be coming to an end. Helen's last dream in therapy was about getting into a lift that, if she wished, could take her to the basement of a building where she could see the roots of trees, the ground of existence. She felt there was an open invitation to step out and walk into this mysterious area if she so wished. But she decided in the dream first to explore the functions of the lift itself. So she took it to the top floor and a flat roof, where, accompanied by a male stranger, she was able to take in an expansive view of the landscape above ground and a night sky that was full of stars, not unlike looking at the alchemical picture I began with at the beginning. Janina Fisher writes, a key ingredient in psychological health is being able to lead and manage the many different parts that exist within us, so that we can create a state of internal harmony and coherence between them. In short, we need to learn how to treat our many different selves in just the same way that a loving parent would treat their children. Fisher's remark suggests that we all have many parts within us that need to be gathered together, with everyone being given a voice around the table, and with warmth and compassion. This is as true in external modern society as it is in our internal psychic society that requires a top to bottom and a left to right balance. While doing my psychoanalytic training in the early 1990s, I came across the writings of the celebrated American psychoanalyst, psychiatrist and professor, Richard Chesick, now a man of 93 and a tremendous output of work over many years. And one of his titles particularly caught my attention, Why Psychotherapists Fail. And as I was about to take on training patients at the time, I was eager to find out. Chesick's primary message was that to engage with patients, clients, the psychotherapist needs to hold in mind two very different maps of meaning. Failure in treatment, writes Chesick, is often the result of one of these maps being unattended to, and then the treatment falling out of creative, imaginative balance. Chesick's first map is a model based on a scientific concept, a sober, mechanistic, factual map, aiming at empirically objective truth. And this map has become increasingly important, and I think necessarily so, in the training of therapists through neuroscience, neurobiology, and attachment theory. Chesick's second map is a non-mechanistic model of the mind concerning what he calls the unfolding of an unconscious project of the core self through human imagination. I think that's just a wonderful phrase. I'm going to read it again. The unfolding of an unconscious project of the core self through human imagination. This map is mythical, dramatic, and teleological, dealing with concepts such as creativity, imagination, and the big emotion-rooted questions such as, what is my life about? Is there a meaning to life? What happens to me when I die? Chesick points out that we can only engage with this map through ciphers of transcendence, a phrase taken from the writings of the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, which reflect our need to seek out and go beyond the literal materialistic known to experience the unknown. So here's Jung's seeking function again. Participation and relationship are the essential aspects of this second map. The unfolding of an unconscious process that starts at birth and continues throughout our lives. So, let me gather all of these themes together. And Richard's right, I do speak bringing a lot of themes together, with an example from the visual arts that is one of my ciphers of transcendence. A large print of the famous Leonardo da Vinci cartoon that was created at the turn of the 16th century when Leonardo was about 50 hangs in my office. In fact, you can probably see it right there, hanging in my office. The subject is the Virgin Mary and Christ child, with St. Anne, Mary's mother, and John the Baptist, Jesus's older cousin. And you can see the real thing in the National Gallery. Although never a finished painting, from its beginnings, queues of people visited this rather extraordinary rendition of two archetypal mothers with two somewhat different archetypal children. I love this image, not for religious reasons, but because Leonardo has managed to bring into a visible form, a visible structure, something that without me realizing it until recent years, echoed the vital balancing of right and left and down and up brain functions of the human mind. The more refined and spiritually conscious Christ child Jesus sits on his mother's knees while facing outwards into the world and blessing his older, swarthy cousin John, his less developed cousin John, while the more refined and conscious Virgin Mary sits firmly on her mother Anne's lap, who is a more shadowy, sensual and uncanny character, offering connection not only with her body and the interweaving and rooting quality of her legs, but also with her intense and mysterious gaze emanating from her eyes and smile. Mary and Jesus represent the brighter light of consciousness that Leonardo suggests is grounded in the rooted energy of the older grandmother and her child. And note that Anne, who is the lap for Mary, is also pointing upwards, indicating for me the right brain link between body-based connections and the more spiritual, mental experiences of mind that have found expression in Panksepp's and Soames, and indeed profoundly in Jung's work. Da Vinci repeats this manner of pointing upwards in his alluring painting of the fully grown John the Baptist, indicating himself as a forerunner of the light, the bodily grounding from which the light emerges. Returning to the original cartoon, these four personalities make up a dynamic relationship, a quaternity of wholeness that Jung was able to finally fully explore with his discovery of alchemy in 1928. It was this that made him feel able to finish writing the Red Book. This archetypal level or hardwired level of the brainstem from which our feelings emerge is called, you'll remember, the hidden spring by Mark Soames. Jung has something similar to say. From the living fountain of instinct flows everything that is creative. Hence, the unconscious is not merely conditioned by history, but is the very source of the creative impulse. It is like nature herself, prodigiously conservative, and yet transcending her historical conditions in her acts of creation. And that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much.